Hi students, this is Mr. Eckert, and this is the very first of a series of recorded narrations that you will watch to get content information outside of the classroom. So in this particular unit, there's 4 learning targets that you're going to focus on, and in this lesson we're going to focus on the first one, which says that you should be able to not only name but also describe at least 5 characteristics or themes of life that apply to all living organisms. So if you think about all living things, from the bacteria that live in your mouth to a redwood tree to maybe your dog, there's characteristics that all of those things have to have in common. So we're going to go through those one by one. And the first is, and of course this is not an inclusive list, there are other characteristics outside of these, but the first is that all living things, if you analyzed what they're made up of, 99% of every living thing is made up of just 6 elements from the periodic table. And those elements are carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. So there's a nonsense word that you can use to remember that. I need tricks to help me to remember things, and I do remember this word chnops or chomps. And so those, of course, are the first letters of each of those elements. But no matter what it is, if you put, let's say you took a fish, put it in a blender, blended it up and poured it in a machine that analyzed it for its component elements, it would spit out a piece of paper that said 99% of that fish is made up of these 6 elements that you see on the screen here. And then if you took a daisy and put it in the same blender, poured it in the same machine, again, it would tell you that 99% of that daisy is made up of these 6 elements, and that's true of every single living thing. All living things are made up of 1 or more cells. You can see in this photograph here, it's actually a photograph of some plant cells, and everything that we see around us is multicellular organisms composed of more than 1 cell. And a lot of things, in fact most of the living things around us, we actually can't see, and those are unicellular. And most of those, of course, are bacteria. All living things need energy and process energy, and we call that metabolism. So all the chemical reactions that go into an organism's energy, we would refer to as its metabolism. Living things replace that lost energy in basically one of 2 ways. Either they're autotrophic, and that means they can convert energy like light energy from the sun or chemical energy deep at the bottom of the ocean into usable energy or stored energy, or like you and me, they have to consume or eat something else in order to replace that lost energy. All living things need water. Water is essential for life. When we send probes to other planets like Mars, of course, that's one of the things we're looking for, because without water there really wouldn't be any life that we know of. So why do living things need water? Well, just about all of the chemical reactions that take place in a cell or in a living organism take place in an aqueous solution in water. And living things, therefore, are made up of mostly water. As you can see here, it says that you and I are about 66% water. Some sources will say we're up to 3/4 water. A jellyfish or a watermelon, of course, would contain a lot more water than that. All living things respond to different stimuli, and here you see a photograph of a spider. And of course, as it's perched on its web and it feels the vibrations in its web, it responds to that stimulus, rushes out to see what's caught in its web. Here's another example of that, dealing with plants. So if you plant a seed, the leaves and the green part of the seed will grow upward, and that's in response to light, which is called phototropism, whereas the roots will grow downward in response to gravity, and that's called geotropism. So that's another example then of a response to a stimulus. Here's a bird that's common in Ohio, and you may have seen it around Gahanna. It's called a killdeer. Unlike most birds, it makes its nests on the ground and actually makes them out of pebbles. Even its eggs look like little pebbles, but if any danger comes close to its nest, the mother bird, when she's sitting on her nest, has a very unusual response to that stimulus. Do you know what it is? She actually pretends that she has a broken wing and extends her one wing and drags it on the ground as she runs away quickly from the nest. And that, of course, is in hopes that the predator or whatever it was that was disturbing her will follow her, thinking that she's an easy meal. And then when she gets far enough away from the nest, she flies up to a tree, waits for the intruder to disappear, and then she returns to her nest. All living things grow and develop. And you can see here the life cycle of a moth. It starts out as eggs. Those hatch into a caterpillar or larva, and then the caterpillar forms a cocoon, or inside the cocoon is a pupa, and that, of course, turns into an adult. So how do living things grow and develop? Well, if it's a unicellular organism, of course, the individual cell grows larger. If it's a multicellular organism, cells do get bigger, but mostly cells divide and more cells are added. So you, of course, have more cells in your body now than you did when you were in 5th grade. Here's a photograph of, obviously, a nest of cottontail rabbits on the left and the same nest on the right. You can see how much they've grown over time. All living things reproduce. This is kind of a common sense characteristic, because without reproduction, obviously, the species would go extinct. And here's a photograph of some barred owls, and these are common owls that we have in Ohio. Here's a female turtle. You can see she's dug a hole in the ground and she's laying eggs. We'll cover those eggs up with the mud, and the ground will actually incubate her eggs, and then the babies, when they hatch, they have to make their way through the mud and to a local water source before something picks them off. But you may have seen this kind of turtle around in Gahanna in some of the creeks and ponds, and it's a snapping turtle. I'm sure you've seen these as well. At top, we've got a mallard hen with her ducklings, and at the bottom, obviously, that's a Canada goose with her goslings. One of those mates for life. Do you know which one? It's the Canada goose. And when we say mates for life, if its mate is, let's say, shot by a hunter, they don't never mate again. They will pick another mate, but they don't mate with multiple partners. They pick one and stay with that partner until that partner dies or they die. All living things have adaptations, and we're going to define adaptations as a physical trait or a behavior that gives an organism an advantage in its environment. You can see in this photograph of a butterfly, it's got this structure that extends from its head that looks like a tube, and that actually is its mouth part. So they have a straw-like mouth part that they use to suck up nectar from flowers, and so that would be a physical adaptation. Here's a muskrat. A lot of students will mistake this for a beaver. It does look like a beaver, but it's much smaller than a beaver. And these are common in Ohio. They're aquatic mammals. They're rodents. So you can probably guess, even if you don't know much about muskrats, what kind of adaptations it would have, since it lives in water. And you'd be right if you said, well, it has webbed feet, it has thick waterproof fur, and its tail, unlike a beaver, which is flattened horizontally, a muskrat's tail is actually flattened vertically. All living things evolve, and we're going to define evolution as a species or a population of organisms changing over time. So you can see in this photograph there's a cockroach on a piece of shale, and in the shale is the imprint of an extinct cockroach that used to live in Ohio, so you can see how large that was. Good thing they don't still live in Ohio. But the reason that individual organisms don't evolve and only populations or species is, if you look at the definition, those changes are passed on genetically through their DNA to future generations. So obviously that can't happen within a single organism. So if you look at these goslings and you think about the changes that they're going to undergo as they turn into the adults that you see in front of them, would you say that that's an example of evolution? And you'd be right if you said no. And because, again, that's a growth and development. The goslings themselves can't evolve because they're not passing on DNA within themselves. That can only happen within a population or a species. And just kind of a random fact, you may recognize this as the state fossil of Ohio. That's a trilobite. And it asks, did this animal experience significant changes over time? You might know a little bit about trilobites and that they lived in shallow seas that once covered Ohio. And of course, they really didn't experience any significant changes over time. So when the shallow seas disappeared, of course, they disappeared as well and went completely extinct. So I would encourage you to review these characteristics and themes. Again, you should be able to name and describe, and when you describe something, it's always good to give some examples. That shows a deeper level of understanding. So you should be able to do that with at least 5 characteristics by the time you get to the test. And if you have any questions, make sure you ask in class. Thanks.